We are now recording, everybody. Hi, welcome to today's CATHETA webinar. You are hearing from us live on May 15th. For those who don't know, CATHETA is the Creek word for learning. And today you're going to be learning about Foundation and Grants Fundraising Overview from your instructor, Maggie Perry. My name is Brooke Warrington. I'm the Training and Development Specialist here at the Native Learning Center. We're also thrilled that you could join us for today's webinar. If you could follow along and read the disclaimer while I say it aloud. This webinar provides a summary of fundamental concepts, requirements, and/or procedures within the allotted 90 minutes. The material discussed does not illustrate all possible scenarios that could be applicable. We also have our copyright infringement law printed here. So this is just a friendly reminder that the webinar materials are protected by copyright, trademark, trade secret, and other intellectual property laws. Know that now that you are a member of the learning platform, you can access today's slides, as well as our other courses that we've hosted on the learning platform in the courses section. But I have also put a link to today's slides in the chat for you. Anytime you log in moving forward during the time of a webinar, you will see that green banner at the top of the screen, and that's how you'll join. We do ask that you tend to join with listen-only capabilities. Just helps to cut down on audio feedback. And if you found that you joined and you are not hearing the sound out of the proper device, you can click on that little telephone icon at the bottom of your screen, and that'll bring up a list of your microphone and your speaker devices, so you can select the one that you want to be using. There's several ways to interact during the webinar. We, of course, want to encourage class participation. We will primarily rely on the public chat. If you don't yet have it open, you can click on public chat in this messages menu, and this will bring it open. If you want to make a comment, ask a question, any tech support problems that I could help you through, you'll just click in the box that says send message to public chat. And you can either hit enter, or you can click on that little paper airplane button, and that'll send it in where we all can see it. We also have the shared notes section where you can find a list of helpful links. The link to our CATHETA archive on YouTube is in there. The webinar feedback survey, your presentation slides. But again, I have put a copy of that for you in the chat. Go ahead and skip this part for now. Just a quick final warning that if you click on the red menu panel to the far left of the screen, that will pull you out of the webinar and take you to whatever you've selected in the menu. You can just rejoin by clicking on the green banner once again. All right, Maggie, I'm going to go ahead and make you presenter now, and I'm going to hand it off to you.
Thank you. Hello, everyone. I'm so happy to be here today. My name is Maggie Perry, and we're going to talk a little bit about foundation and grants. We're going to talk about government grants, we're going to talk about foundation grants, and we're going to talk about really how that all comes together and putting together really competitive grant proposals. I have been a grant professional for 15 years. I started working in municipal government fresh out of college, and I was working as a secretary position and started getting interested in the world of grants there. I was learning more about it at that level, at the local government level. And then I went on to become the grant manager for the same city that I was living and working in. And I did that for about 10 years. I've been with the D.H. Leonard team for going on 6 years now. And in my position here, I am considered the writing team product owner. So I get to work with clients all over the country, and I get to learn about all different missions, and it's really an exciting job. I have a bachelor's degree in history, so I really love research and writing, which tied really nicely into my current profession. And I'm a big autumn fall fan. So we're going into the summer months. It is warm and humid here in northeastern Pennsylvania, and currently pouring rains, as it's been for many days. So that's what's happening in my neck of the woods. What we'll cover today, we're going to talk about the difference between foundation funding and government funding. We're going to help you understand what the grant application process looks like, what funders like to see in grant applications, and how to make those stronger. And of course, there's going to be an opportunity to ask questions and answers at the end. But if there's something that we're going over at the moment and you have a question about it, please feel free to put that in the chat, and I would love to answer that question in real time. Or so our little check-in question today, and you can go ahead and put this in the chat, is what are you most excited about this month? I can't believe May is half over already. So maybe what you were most excited about has already come and gone. I have to admit, I'm pretty excited about the 3-day weekend, Memorial Day weekend coming up next week. I'm very much looking forward to that. But how about you all? What are you most excited about this month? Ooh, I see Brooks presenting a conference in LA. Oh, I've never been on the West Coast, so I'm quite jealous. Enjoy the time in your conference. Okay, let's start talking about the key types of grant organizations. So it's critical to understand the type of grant maker you're looking for. And are you looking to get into government funding, or are you primarily looking at foundation, or maybe a mix of both? And understanding what type of grant maker you're looking for will help you think about your funding. Is it long-term or short-term? And also understanding the grant maker, it's important to understand what type of funder it is, if it's government or if it's nonprofit, if it's private, if it's corporate. And the reason is because they're motivated by different things. So when we think about what motivates the grant funder, it's important to remember that there's a difference between government and private. When we're thinking about our government funding, we're thinking about the fact that they're primarily, focused on, motivated by public policy goals and priorities either at the state or the national level. And that, especially if we're talking about state funding, it changes from state to state, what the focus is, what their priorities are in each state. At the federal level, typically we have an understanding, at least for a few years, of what the priorities are. But government agencies, they allocate the funding to address specific issues. So some states you might see that are very much focused on workforce development and public health. Other states might have a large focus on education access or environmental issues. And so understanding the priorities for the government agencies that you're looking at and what they're really focusing on at this time is a great way to get comfortable with the type of funding you're looking at. Now, there's different types of government funding. We have federal all the way at the top, and then we have the state level, which we're talking about now. But there's also city and county level funding. I was working for my local municipality. That's one of the things I did. I worked in the Office of Community Development. So we helped oversee grant applications that applicants in the city were applying to the city for funding. So there's often opportunities to apply at the city or the county level for funding, especially the Community Development Block Grant, which is something that most regions receive and have some funding that they can implement in their communities. And that primarily is meant to influence and support low-income individuals. And then, like I said, at the state and federal level, those are different ways to look at that. Now, federally, when you're looking at the types of sources of funding, your best resource to check out is grants.gov. Grants.gov is a free resource. It's the way that they release grant opportunities, and also for many agencies, it's also what you apply through. You apply through grants.gov. It's like the portal that they utilize. But grants.gov is typically where the new guidelines and new requests for proposals, or even forecasted requests for proposals, are being posted. And when we're talking about forecasted, what we mean by that is that things that are going to be projected to open in the future, that they know it's something that's going to be funded, but the open date just hasn't been there yet. And utilizing that forecasted proposals is helpful because it helps you kind of plan ahead and think about what's coming. At the state level, when you're looking for different grant opportunities, it can be a little bit tricky because many states don't have one place to look. I'm in Pennsylvania, and here there is not one like main database to find all the grant opportunities. You have to pay attention to the different agencies. So when you understand the type of funding you're looking for, so if you're looking to support educational programs, youth, mental health, public health, if these are the types of things you're looking at, then those are the specific agencies you want to pay attention to. And one of the tricks that I used to use when I was looking for state funding in my own state is to just set like Google alerts with different agencies when they post grant opportunities, so that when something's there, you can become aware of it right away. Like I said, most states don't have one clearinghouse where they share all the grant information. If you are in a state that has something like that, you are lucky because it's not typically the case, or at the city or county level as well. Typically what you have to do is pay attention to the different agencies. So if you're wondering, one way to understand what the priorities are and what they're going to be funding is to look at the budgets each year. Federal budget is very large, and it's not meant that you should read everything in the federal budget, but looking again at the specific agencies and programs that you're interested in, seeing what is going to be listed and what is marked in the federal budget will help you understand what kind of grants are going to be available. And that's typically the same with the state and county and city budgets as well. When you look at where they're allocating resources, it can help you understand what to look for in the future, what grant funding is. Now, the difference is with foundation funding is that they're less focused on, in fact, sometimes they're often very different from the priorities of government funding. They're driven by their own mission and their own goals. So when you're thinking about foundation funders, you want to think about there's different types as well. You have our corporate funders, family foundations, private, and then the public grant makers or the government ones we're talking about. Our corporate funders, they're the ones that are associated with some sort of corporation or big business. A lot of large businesses and large corporations have a funding arm, like a philanthropy arm, where they support, especially in the communities where they operate or they have employees that live. Sometimes they do sponsorships, but sometimes they do have competitive grant process that allows organizations in the communities where they live and work to compete, to apply for corporate funding. So they're a great resource to look at, especially if you have large corporations in the areas that you're looking to geographically be funded, to certainly look at what they have to offer those corporations. Often you see corporate funders have the least amount of strings attached. They're usually lighter on the reporting side, and they're not as involved as some of the other types of grant makers are. So your family foundations are just what they sound like. They're family foundations are controlled usually by a board or a trust, and they are related to a philanthropic family. They're usually very tied to their mission and their strategic priorities, and the same with private funders as well. So it's important to really understand, just like at the government level, like when you're looking at the budget, you're trying to see what they're funding, where are they putting their money. It's the same thing that you want to do with the foundation type grant makers, because it's really important to understand what's a priority for them so you can understand how you can make that priority connection with your organization. Now that we kind of provided a very high level overview of what types of funders there are, now we're going to talk a little bit about what we call the grant life cycle. It's really a best practice that is involved in how to have a really successful grant strategy. And it goes across readiness, research, relationships, writing, and reporting. We're going to talk a little bit on each one today. The first thing we're going to think about is grant readiness. And what we mean by that is organizationally, are you ready to both apply for and implement the grants? I think it's often considered, yeah, we want to apply for grants, but do you have the personnel in place? Do you have the policies in place to then also implement and track funding, to do that sort of accounting? So those are some things to think about when it comes to grant funding, and if you have the structure in place that you need to both receive and issue funding. On top of that, organizationally, do you have things in place such as, your financial documentations, your audit, board lists, program descriptions, things like that funders typically want to see as part of a general grant application. These are the things that you want to make sure that helps you understand if your organization is grant ready. I think another piece of grant readiness that is often overlooked is the buy-in from the organization throughout. I think when individuals are tasked with looking for grants and kind of trying to find grants to run programs, you want to make sure that everyone within the organization kind of understands the responsibility associated with that. Often you need to have signature or approval from executive director or whoever the highest ranking member of the organization is. We just did one recently where we had to actually have the executive director and the executive on the board also both sign off on a grant application that was required by the funder. So staff and personnel and the responsibility that goes with that is an important part of grant readiness. If you are considering government funding, that is a little bit more intense in terms of managing than foundation typically is, especially at the federal level, because you have to do a separate audit for federal funding. They have very so these are just things to take in consideration when you are looking at the government level of funding, because there is a little bit more of a commitment there. And with government funding and foundation funding sometimes too, there's usually reporting either way, but with the government funding, you often have reporting that's both, you have to do program reporting and a separate fiscal report. They're often quarterly, so there's a lot of upkeep there on the side of government funding when it comes to managing the grant. So these are the kind of conversations that you want to have before applying to make sure that you have the capacity to manage the grant, you have the capacity to oversee it, and everyone kind of understands what their roles and responsibilities are. So you could think about this as really a grant team. I've worked with organizations who are really large, hundreds of people, work for them. And, you might have different personnel from different departments involved in the grant team. Or I've been worked with organizations where they're really small and it's really, one person's wearing all the hats. They're the program person and they're doing the budgets and, they have some leadership experience as well. No matter what kind of organization you work for, or if you're somewhere in the middle, you want to make sure that you have people involved. Like I said before, thinking about leadership, executive director, your board, you want them to understand what grants are, understand the grant process, and be involved in that. And then also another key person is maybe whoever's doing your budgets. Project budgets are almost always a requirement, whether it's foundation funding or it's government funding. It's a big piece. So you often have to include both organizational budget and a project budget, which we're going to talk about a little bit later. But you want to make sure you have the person there that can put the numbers together that are feasible and that you can really, if you get awarded, that these will make sense. This will cover the costs that you're looking for. So having someone there from the financial side is really important. And also your program people. Like I said, you might be that person. You might be doing the running the programs and applying for the grants. That's often the case. But in the event that you have someone different running your program who's doing the grants, you want to be able to have ongoing conversations with the program staff so you understand what's going on, what's changing, what's new, so that when you're putting grant proposals together, it's the most up-to-date information that is available. It's reflective of what's happening, like the program's outcomes right now. So you don't want to wait to have a grant team kind of formulate when you're just starting to apply. We recommend you having those conversations on a regular basis. So putting together kind of a grant plan for the year and sitting down with people from your organization saying, look, here's what we plan to apply for this year. Here's what we know right now. Here's the funders we definitely want to apply to. And sitting down and saying, okay, what information do we need to put together a competitive grant application? Well, we're going to need this kind of information from program staff and this kind of information from finance, and we'll need the executive director to sign off. And when you have those conversations ahead of time, it takes the pressure off, I think, a little bit, because grants are typically deadline driven. And you don't want to, one of the things we always say is you don't want to submit the day of the deadline, because we have seen many technical difficulties with portals on the day of the deadline, because many organizations are in there doing it, and a lot of times portals cannot handle the volume, and weird things will happen. They'll freeze up or they'll shut down. We've had funders have to push back the deadline because the portal crashed. And I've seen it on the government side too, even in grants.gov, with some really competitive opportunities where so many people go in at the same time that it really slows the process down. So you always want to plan to submit early, and you want to start thinking about what's coming up in the future in the next quarter. If you haven't had the conversation already, like thinking about the calendar year, it's never too late to start. I think one way to do it is to think about, okay, in the next quarter, here are our grant deadlines. Let's start pulling information together now. Let's start working on drafts now, so that once it's time to submit, that can be an easy process. But it's really hard to do that without buy-in from the organization, right? Without buy-in from the team. I used to joke, I used to say that when I was working in municipal government, a lot of people misunderstand grants and kind of the requirements that come with them. I'll say the strings that are attached. There's reporting, you have to spend this money in a certain way. And I used to joke that people would come up and want grants for everything. And I'd say, oh, I'll just go pull a leaf from my grant tree in the backyard, right? Because sometimes I think there's a misconception that it's a really easy thing to do. But putting a competitive grant application together and finding the right funder actually takes time and takes patience. So in still thinking about organizational readiness, we actually have a tool. It's called the GRASP tool, and it's a free resource on our website. And what this does is it's a tool that organizations can use that helps you see how grant ready you are. And it shows you this in a few different ways. If you see the slide on the screen, you kind of see it breaks it down into these different categories. So if you're looking at government funding versus foundation funding, what kind of financials that you have in order. It's asking you questions about your program evaluation, sustainability. It's looking at all these different pieces of your organization to help determine if you are grant ready. And you get a score with it. And the score is not say you're good or bad. The score is just to say, here's the places that you're strong and here's the places where there's some weaknesses that you can improve on. So if anything, excuse me, I think the tool is really helpful just to walk away and say, okay, what are our weaknesses? Because every organization has weaknesses, right? There's places that you can strengthen, there's places that you can improve. But I've actually seen this used as a tool because grant staff, right, people who are working on the grants don't feel like they're really being heard for the organizational things that need to happen to be more grant ready. And it's something you can bring to leadership. It's a resource that you can bring and say, look, we've used, a certified tool that is telling us these are the areas that we can strengthen. We worked with an organization that came very far along on a federal National Science Foundation proposal, and they knew that there were issues with their time management accounting system. It was a weakness that was ignored for a while that had been called out by other funders. And they ended up losing. They were awarded and they got it taken away because they didn't meet certain criteria, which was something, like, again, that was brought to their attention ahead of time, but that leadership didn't take action on. So nothing's ever 100% set in stone. These are kind of the things that you want to be mindful of, and having a resource like this and a tool that kind of looks at the whole big picture and looks at it from organizationally all the way down to your programs. Are your programs grant ready as well? And that can help you kind of know what to do and present that argument, to your grant team, and you can work together on trying to address that. Okay, so that's a very, high level overview of grant readiness. Like I said, taking a slow approach to grants is really your best bet. Thinking about it in a planning way and thinking ahead will set you up for success big time. And the first thing you want to think about, if you are not an organization who applies for grants regularly, or if you're an organization who's typically relied on foundation, but now you'd like to start a government or vice versa, it's really taking a step back first and making sure you have all the things in place for the readiness to apply for and to be able to implement that funding and be held accountable for it. And that will help you feel more confident in your readiness. So now we're going to start thinking about research. And research, I think, is often part of the cycle that is taken for granted a little bit. And I say that because I'm going to go back to my grant tree example where it's like, oh, I just go in the back and you pull a leaf and there you go, you can get a grant. I think there's a lot of misconception about, well, there's all these grants, there's tons of money out there, just go find one. But it's not that simple. And it's really important that you find funders that would make a good partner for you and you for them. And that's really going to tie into relationships, which we're going to talk about in a little bit, but because it really is a partnership, and it's not, if you spend a lot of time just applying for organizations that you didn't research, just any grant opportunity you see and going after, you're going to be wasting your time and resources, and you'll be wasting the funders as well. So doing prospect research is a very important part of the grant life cycle. But luckily there's tools, right? There's tools to help utilize this. I've used all of these tools. We use all of these tools as part of our strategy. So, and they all have different strengths and weaknesses. I think Foundation Directory Online is probably one of the most known, I think because it's like the original, right? I feel like we've been using that for a long time. That's been around for a very long time. The thing is that some of these are subscription based. So what that means is then there's a fee that you have to pay, which not a lot of organizations can afford to pay for the subscription. So one of the things I always recommend is that a lot of local libraries have a subscription to Foundation Directory, especially or often paying for it, but they let people come in and utilize it. Our local library actually had a librarian there who was pretty well versed in it and could help. In my early days, I relied on that a lot, kind of pointing me in the right direction of which search criteria to use and how to use it. So Foundation Directory Online is like I said, it's probably one of the oldest ones. GrantStation is a great tool as well. Instrumental is a little bit newer, just in the last few years, I believe, but they approach it a little bit differently. But I really like it. One of the things that we like about Instrumental is that you could set up kind of a project in the tool. And so for your organization, what your key priority areas are, you can set up a project for that. And then it pulls funders to you. So what that means is it'll create a list based on the criteria that you're putting in. So if you are an organization that's focusing on, let's say, substance abuse, then you could put in keywords related to that, and then it'll pull funders who have that same sort of language in their organizational profiles. So it helps kind of bring the research to you instead of you starting from square one and looking through long lists of different funders. But like I said, it does take time. It does take patience to find the right funder. The things that you really want to look for when you're thinking about who the funder is. First, you want to look at their mission. Okay, who are they? What is this organization about? What are their priorities? And does it align with your mission? If they're an organization looking to fund, environmental issues, and you are an organization that needs support for youth mental health, probably not going to be a good fit for you. So first thing you're looking at is what is their mission and does it align with yours? A lot of funders do not accept unsolicited proposals. And that means a few things. Commonly, what it means is that they invite organizations to apply to them. They don't, it's not an open process where just anyone can apply. or they have a specific list of organizations, that's who they regularly fund. And that's, it's not an open process. We look at these funders and we don't think of them as a no. I don't immediately cancel them out. If I find a funder that's such a good fit, like mission aligns, who they're funding, what they're doing, it's very similar to the organization that I'm working with, I'm going to keep them in mind and consider doing some outreach. Because sometimes, and we've seen this language used with different organizations where they'll say, we're not accepting anyone, but we would like to hear about your project, and they'll give some information there. Unless they explicitly say, do not contact us, I say, give them a try. Try for some outreach and talk about your organization. We're going to talk about that a little bit more when it comes to relationships, but you want to really think about, if they're very strong fit, because you have to be able to kind of sell that to the funder. They don't accept unsolicited proposals, but you just want them to know what you're doing out there that aligns so well and you thought they'd be interested in. So that's kind of outreach you can try to do with funders that are really, really good fit, but aren't actively accepting applications. Another important piece is the geographic restrictions. So where are they funding? Even I've seen with large funders who say, like, we fund nationwide, when you use your search tools, so the ones we just showed on the screen are actually, they have in there the geographic breakdown of where these funders are serving. So you can download out and you could say, oh, ABC Foundation says they're national, but they really have only funded in Pennsylvania, New York, New Jersey, maybe a handful of states. And we see that a lot. So when a funder says they accept applications from these areas, look at who they're actually funding, because that will help you tell more of a story about where the money's going. If you live in a geographic area that this funder has never supported before, it doesn't necessarily make it a no, but it's something extra to consider. Now, some funders will say, I only accept applications in these geographic areas. If they call it out specifically, then, and you're not in that area, then that's a definite no. But if they, you are in that area, but they don't typically fund there, again, it's not a no. It's just something that can be used for part of your conversation and part of your outreach. We recommend with every prospect that you find, every potential funder, you attempt outreach. You want to start forming a relationship with this funder. It's a really, really important piece, and we'll talk a little bit more about that. Another thing to consider is the average grant size. So if a funder's average grant size is $5,000 to $10,000, and again, in the tools that we talked about, it will tell you what the average grant size is. If the funder's average grant size is $5,000 to $10,000, but you need a project that's $100,000 or $150,000, that's what your project budget is, you don't want to apply to that funder, because you don't want to go in asking for way more than they typically give. And, again, it's going to be a waste of your time and theirs. If it's within the range of what they typically fund, then that's another box checked of them being a yes. If it's close but a little off, then that's something that you want to bring up in your outreach conversation as well. What we typically see with new funders is that if it's the first time applying, you really don't want to go outside the confines of what their average grant amount is. We see that funders who have relationships with organizations and are very comfortable with them often will grow in how they're supporting them, because they've built that trust and confidence. But if it's a first time and you go in way above, what their average grant size is, they're just not going to be able to entertain that. So you really want to stick close to it. And if you have a very large project that's like $100,000, $150,000, this funder only does, $10,000, $20,000. The question maybe to bring back to the grant team, especially with a funder that looks like a great fit, is, can we break this down? Is there a portion of this that we can request? Can we put this in a phased approach? Are there ways to break the budget down where we can maybe go for some smaller asks and build the relationships with these funders before going for, all in on a larger ask? And I think that's something to consider too. So not an automatic no, but takes a little bit more work, a little bit more conversation if their average grant size is very different from the funding that you need. I always recommend, when thinking with large projects, large budget, six-figure budgets, right? Is to think about it. Can you, even before you start looking at funders, is there a way to break this up into smaller bites? And if the answer is no, sometimes that's the case. Maybe it's a capital project or something like that, where it really can't be broken out any smaller. That's okay. But sometimes it can't. And that will help you then attract some of these smaller funders and still have a viable project, right? That's something to consider and something you can discuss with your grant team. And that would take conversation with your budget people and your program people to think about how can we break this down and maybe get some smaller funders excited. Another piece to look at is the previous grantees. Now this goes into when you're using the search tool, you're thinking about where are they funding, how much are they funding, and who are they funding. Sometimes funders might list like 3 or 4 priorities, maybe more. And then when you look at it and you see what they're funding and who they're funding, it's really in maybe just 1 or 2 of the priority areas. Also, you want to see, do the organizations, are they similar to yours? Are you completely different than anything that they're funding? Maybe you're a library and they're primarily funding hospitals. Again, it could look really good. The website, the information's looking good, but once you see who they're funding and where they're funding, it tells you a little bit more of the story. And that ties into their public voice. And when I say public voice, what we mean by that is, what information are they putting out to the public? Almost everyone has some sort of social media, right? Whether it's Facebook or they have an Instagram or they're putting things on YouTube or they're just publishing on their website and their newsletter and things like that. What are the stories that they're telling? What kind of language are they using? This is going to tell you a lot about the funder. So sometimes we see a little bit of a difference, right? Where their website maybe hasn't been updated in a while, but the things that they're putting out in through different channels, really, that's a current snapshot of what's important to them, what kind of messaging that they're using, what would resonate with them. So you want to go a little bit deeper than just looking at their websites or just using those, those search tools. They're a great first step to kind of identify the funders. But then once you identify them, you want to go a little bit deeper. Look for their website, look for their social channels. What does their newsletter say? That's really going to help you have an understanding of the funder and then think about next steps in the sense of how do we reach out then? What do we say? Sometimes funders will say, here's how we want to be communicating. They'll give you an email address, they'll tell you who to contact. I'd say often that's not the case. Sometimes you have to dig a little bit deeper to find that, but like I said, unless a funder explicitly says, do not contact us, which sometimes is the case because they just don't have the capacity to answer all the inquiries, then I say, outreach is on the table and it's something to consider. And anything you find in terms of phone number or email would be something that you would utilize to do that communication. I think a phone conversation, if possible, is or kind of like a Zoom or Teams, whatever it is, conversation, a face-to-face conversation goes farther than email. I think it makes it more personal, it makes it more memorable. People get, think about how many emails you might ignore in a day. But having an actual conversation with someone is much more difficult to ignore. So remember, your first step when doing your research is you want to think about organizationally, what are our needs? Are we ready? Tools, identifying the for our research practice, we actually we have what's called a research folder. And in there, we put everything we can find from the funders 990, screenshots of their website, certainly any guidelines, any grant guidelines that they might have. Another really important piece to consider is who's on their board. They're usually public. If they don't have a website that shows who the funders board is, then they might have, it's going to be in their 990. It will be, many of the tools that we talked about also list the board. And why this is important, especially if they're in the same geographic area as you, is that because there could be a connection. So when we're putting together prospect research, and we're putting together these folders, we're putting the list. We actually call it our funder relationship questionnaire. And we call it a questionnaire because we'll put the list of the board and the staff on this little template. And then we use that to disseminate that to an organization's staff or their board and say, hey, here's the board of ABC Foundation. Does anybody know anybody here? Is anyone familiar to you? Because we see that the conversations goes much more easily when there's that kind of warm connection. Doesn't mean it could still happen even if there isn't a connection, but if there is, that's a great first step. So that's a really important piece too, when putting together that research, your initial research on the funder, taking this account, these pieces here, but also who's working for them, who's on their board, to see if there is any connection. And you'd be surprised at how many times it's like, oh yeah, I know so-and-so because we work together here, whatever it is. And that's great. And again, utilize your board. That's part of their job is to help inform these relationships. So staff usually have a lot on their plate, but this is something that the board can help with. I've been on boards, and that's usually one of my first questions. Like, well, can I look at the funders? Can I do anything there? Can I, help do outreach for new funders? Because that's an important piece too. And this goes right into the next piece of the grant life cycle, which is relationships. Because when you're thinking about the funder awardee, it's not just so transactional. It really is a partnership. Funders are looking to support organizations who are going to use their money successfully, and it's going to help move forward their mission and their priorities. So it's a partnership in that sense. And of course, you want to utilize the funding to be successful in your mission and priorities. But the reason it's a partnership is because that those align. And you want to take the extra steps to make sure that it's a relationship that you're taking care of. If I can get anything through to those listening today, I would say don't treat the grant maker like an ATM. You want to have kind of that personal relationship and that buy-in from anyone who funds your organization. And those can go from all different ways. If the only time the funders are hearing from you is when you need money, it's not going to, they're not going to love that, because they have other organizations who are probably sharing with them, throughout the grant term, providing updates, letting them know what's going on, showing gratitude, and that's going to go a lot farther than just them hearing from you maybe once a year, once every other year when it's time to do that grant renewal. We talk about next level gratitude. So more than just, a thank you, but what can you do to really show your gratitude to these different funders? And there's lots of ways you can do that. Highlighting it in your newsletter, giving shout outs on social media to those that are supporting you. If you have any sort of fundraising events, using those as opportunities to really highlight your funders. But also just checking in with them, letting them know, telling them testimonials. I have seen so many funders just really respond well to a great story of someone that their funding impacted, a really personal story. And, you might have to change the names just for confidentiality purposes, but just those types of things, just dropping in their email, like, listen, I just want to let you know that this is kind of the impact that you have. And I think that goes farther than the reports, the numbers, the budget stuff. Hearing like an actual story, a testimonial from the clients that you're serving and for those you're impacting, I think really goes far with a funder. We've seen organizations even have clients write thank you letters, if the funding's supporting their journey or their needs. We've seen thank you letters come from the people that are being impacted too. And I'll tell you, those really go a long way. It's just to let them know the humanistic side of the work that you're doing. And it's important for everyone, I think, to remember that. So remember, you don't want to treat the grant maker like an ATM. You want it to be a personal relationship. And I think that when you think about the way that a grant maker feels, so one of the questions here is, how do you think the grant maker feels when approached in an unsolicited way? They would be surprised. They'd be surprised by the request. So if a funder sees an application come across their desk from an organization they have never heard of, that they've never known about, will they read it? Probably, but it's not going to stand out to them. When you do the outreach and you have that initial conversation with the funder, now when that application comes across their desk, they're going to remember that conversation. They're going to remember you. And we've seen it greatly enhance the chances of getting funded. So it's just something that when you're doing your prospect research, a part of that is thinking about your communication strategy for these new funders, and also the continued relationship building with your current funders. That piece is very, very, and just as important, because it's when you have the good relationships that you'll see the funders maybe increase your renewals or go from project funding to more unrestricted funding, which is always a big help to every organization. But it's when they have really good relationships that we see that happen the most. So you want to remember, just hold on tight to your current funders, treat them well, bring them for site visits. If in person aren't possible, I've been seeing really cool things being done with like virtual site visits, even a slideshow of pictures of things that are happening is a great way to share feedback and information and kind of do a virtual site visit. So just remember, you want to keep that connection with the funders. But also, it's just as important, like I said, for the new ones. Sometimes it's a little bit frustrating. You'll be doing outreach and maybe you're not getting anywhere, but just keep going. My general rule of thumb is that I like to do, like I said, if possible, to have a phone call or like a Zoom virtual meeting or an in-person meeting. That to me is best. But if you've reached out and you haven't heard back, I always say try again, but try a different method. So if you tried by phone and you got no call back, maybe try email, or if you started with email, then maybe try phone. But I would do at least 1 or 2 follow-ups before, I'd say not to continue to try that relationship. But if it's a really good fit and they are accepting, like it's an open proposal process, just because you didn't have that initial conversation doesn't mean you shouldn't apply. Don't take them off the list. Do your due diligence, try the outreach, but if it doesn't work out, then still keep them on the list. Because what we've also seen is that if the funder wasn't responsive to the initial outreach, we have seen, using even if it's a denial, even if you apply and you're denied, using that as a way to follow up and say, we really love the work that you're doing. We've applied, but we weren't, accepted. Sometimes funders will give you feedback and say exactly why. More times than not, it's a generic reason. But even if it is a generic reason, such as like, oh, we had too many to apply, not enough funding, which is often the case. I mean, that's the truth. If that happens, I say, reach out. Who's the person that sent you the denial? Did that come in through email? Did it come in through mail? Like, how did you receive that? Reach out to that person. Thank you so much. I would love to have a conversation about, why this was denied. And that's another way to think about doing outreach and kind of forming a relationship. It's very hard with a first-time funder to get funded. It's usually when you're got up and you have to swing at the plate the first time, you're going to miss. And it's not necessarily anything about your organization or your application. It's just because you're new and they don't know you, and they're more likely to fund organizations they're aware of. So, but again, it doesn't mean don't apply again. It doesn't mean don't try again. It just means take extra steps to kind of form that relationship with the funder and to give that a try. So the next R is writing, which we're going to talk about a little bit. So hold tight, because we're actually going to talk about reporting. And the reason I want to go into reporting is it ties into the relationship piece. Reporting it's usually a part of every grant application. Like I said, the ones that I see reporting the least is with corporate, but most foundations have some sort of report due. Governments have multiple. With foundations, you're at the very least going to have to do like a end report, when the grant period's over. But often you're going to have to do maybe quarterly or at least biannually reports. It depends on how long the grant period is. If you think about a typical grant period is a year, you're most likely going to have like a 6-month report as well as your year-end report. When we're thinking about that relationship piece, you want to take in consideration that it doesn't always go as planned in terms of how the grant is being implemented. we're seeing, I mean, even now, there's a lot of change in the landscape of funding, especially on the government side. And it's affecting a lot of organizations in a negative way. That's done. Another example of this is when COVID happened. I mean, that was a huge upheaval to so many programs and so many organizations providing, at the time, everything was in person, right? And a lot of programs had to come to a halt because of that. So things happen, there's staff turnover, things change. Generally, what I see is that funders understand that as long as you keep an open communication. So don't wait until the report's due to give them an update on, like, if something's not going exactly as planned, let them know right away. Keep them in the loop of what's happening. I've seen, again, when that happens, more times than not, the funder understands, will talk through it, even might allow you to, like, repurpose some of the funding, maybe to a different line item, or if there were staff changes or things, as long as you're open and honest about it and let them know. Don't wait until the report is due. And also, you want to be on time with your reports. You want to get those submitted early when possible, because the report really ties into the relationship too. That's showing the funder that you are doing what you said you were going to do. It's building that confidence and trust with them. And it's another, piece in the relationship puzzle. So you want to make sure you know when those reports are due and that you're answering every question really thoroughly. And I see with reports too as another great way. A lot of times reports will allow you to share, an optional attachment or any additional information. And that's another opportunity to share testimonials and share client stories and just really show the human side of the impact that's happening with this organization. But the report is a great check-in time. But like I said before, don't let it be the only time, right? Don't let the funder only hear from you at the reporting time, the renewal time. Have touch points throughout the year. Let them know what's going on. Invite them to events if possible, to really help that relationship grow. So when it comes to the other side of this, when we think back about grant readiness and organizationally, are we grant ready? Take into account, well, who's doing the reports? Who's responsible for that piece? Who's collecting the data? At the very least, if you're serving a number of individuals, they're going to want to know how many are served. Are you meeting your outcomes? And then the other question you often see with reports is regarding the budget. Are you on track to spend down the funding? Do you think that you'll achieve that by the end of the grant period? And again, if the answer is no, that's okay, as long as you're honest about it and you let them know what's going on. But those are the types of things that go into reports. So having individuals in the organization who can respond to that, who are tracking that information, who are tracking how the money's being spent down. I've seen some reports where they just ask a simple yes or no question if you're on track with the financial side of it. I've seen others that want an actual printout proof. Here's how it was spent. Here's where every penny went, who it went to, what pay period and things like that. So you want to be prepared to really account for your reporting that way. So going back, because we can't emphasize this enough, thinking about next level gratitude, right? So this is when you don't want your interactions with the funder to feel transactional. You want them to feel like it's a partnership. You want them to feel buy-in and investment in your organization and to be something that's excited that they talk about. And that's sometimes one of the questions I like to ask funders. I like to hear them tell me about organizations that they're really proud of, or who they're funding, because it kind of helps them. You see who's forming good partnerships and how much that means to the funder. So that's something to consider too when you're thinking about that initial outreach and forming the kind of foundation for the relationship. Usually that conversation is pretty quick. Going back to that initial outreach, we think of it almost like our elevator pitch. Like if you had 90 seconds in the elevator with a funder, how would you sell yourself? How would you, here is Bill Gates. He walked in and he wants to hear about your organization. You have one elevator ride. How would you sell it? So even developing that part of it might take a few people on your team to think about, right? Program people, executive director, what do they want to highlight? Finance. what is our elevator pitch for each program, so that way when you have an opportunity to talk with a funder, and sometimes they come up at the weirdest times, it's not necessarily just an outreach call, but you might meet someone at an event or something like that, and you want to be able to kind of convey a message about what your programs are and the impact you're having, and without taking up too much time. So that's another thing I like to talk about when thinking about grant readiness, and kind of going over with the grant team, what would we say, what are our points we want to highlight, because that will go into the grant application piece, which we're going to talk about next. But it also will go into the conversations with the funders and making sure you want to get the same message conveyed. And again, going back, it's partnership. It's a partnership. These funders have a board to report to too. So, they have accountability for how they're spending, their money, and what organizations it's supporting, and what those, are they achieving goals and that aligns with their strategic priorities. So they have to be able to explain it to their board as well. So you want them to really know you and understand what's happening, so that way they can go and sing your praises, and you can hopefully have a long funding relationship. Because that's really the ultimate goal for both sides. Funders love having organizations that they can fund over a long period of time, and kind of build in those strategic priorities with. It's really important. So now we're going to go back to the writing piece. We're going to back up a little bit, and we're going to talk about how to put together, really competitive grant proposals. So here are what we call the common elements of a grant application. Now, every application is a little bit different. I was working with organizations in the state of Illinois, and my goodness, every agency has a whole different application setup and different questions, and nothing's the same. And it's like, oh, you really have to read carefully all the guidelines there. But generally, what you'll see in a grant application, whether it's a portal that has you can only put in so many counted characters, or it's a long government application where you can do a 20-page narrative. We did one recently that was a 75-page narrative with 75 pages of attachments. So it took a lot of planning, a lot of teamwork to get that done. But no matter what the structure is, you're typically going to have some sort of need statement. Okay, you're going to think about what is the need in the community that you are addressing. You want to make sure you have some data to support that. It could be, regional data. Maybe you're using a public health agency. Maybe you're using, school district data, whatever your organization does, but you want to have some hard numbers to show that this is a need in your community. And you also want to show that it's a need for your organization. So you think about it two ways. You think big picture, here's our community need. This is a gap in the community services or whatever it is. But then you have to justify the need for the funding, right? So what's your organizational need to help address this? Are you trying to grow your program? Are you trying to expand to meet an increasing number? Are you trying to sustain your programs? Now, one thing we're seeing a lot is the impact of the federal budget cuts and how negatively that's impacting a lot of organizations. And that's part of their story. We had federal funding that is now in jeopardy. We really need, some foundation funding to help fill these budget gaps. Whatever it is, you just want to be able to explain it with some hard data. So if it comes down to, well, we are trying to expand, then you want to be able to say, well, why is there an expansion? Do you have a wait list? Are you getting feedback from the clients that you're serving that you need, more programming in this area? Whatever it is, and that kind of information is great. Anytime you can provide feedback from the clients you're serving, whether it's through a survey mechanism, or even if it's anecdotal, if it's just stories that they're sharing, hey, we really could use more of this. That I think that really resonates with funders, because you're listening to those you're serving. And I actually see that question a lot in applications, where they want to know, how are you taking into account the people who are benefiting from this? And I think that that's something that was often overmissed. like 10 years ago, it wasn't very common to see people being served as part of the conversation and how programs were structured or how policies were developed. And now that is becoming much more common, thankfully, as it should, because they're the people benefiting from it. So they should have, they're the best ones to give you feedback as to what the program needs. So that ties into your needs statement. So you think like, in the community, what do we need? But also, what does the organization need, right? Why this grant? Why now? Why you? These are the types of things you want to think about in your needs statement. Then you're going to get into your program description. So your program description is going to do what it says, describe your program, but it's got to tie back to that needs statement. So if you say our need is, a case manager, then you have to be able to, your program description shouldn't be paying for a STEM education teacher. You know what I'm saying? Like it should connect together with your needs statement. So what you're describing in your program, so you can do like a big picture, here's everything our program does, and then kind of refine it to, here's what the grant is going to help us to do. Here's the position it's going to help us fulfill. Here's the curriculum that's going to help us develop, or the activities that'll help us have. Those are the types of things that you want to talk about in your program. Then you have your, some funders really want to know a lot in evaluation, some not so much. Government-wise, it's going to be a big piece of any application, talking about how you evaluate the program. So earlier when I said, you want to understand your needs statement, right? You want to think about organizationally, why is this a need? Your evaluation section is how you prove it. So how do you evaluate your programs? Understanding that is really crucial. And this goes back to thinking about your grant team, right? Talking to program staff. We work with one organization and we realized that they had at least 6 programs that they ran. They're primarily a youth serving organization, helped homeless youth. So they offered everything from a food pantry, case management, mental health, housing, educational support, GED services. It really, they offered a lot. And what we realized through kind of that planning, when we're thinking about grants long term, we were thinking about, well, how's everybody collecting data? And every program was doing it differently. And that really made it hard to talk about it at an organizational level because they weren't tracking similar things. And it was through grant team meetings and bringing everyone to the table and saying like, all right, how are you evaluating your programs, that we realized that. So in some ways it was okay, but we also wanted to have a commonality in the data that was being collected and how it was being done and how programs were being evaluated. So because when there is a commonality there, you can show progress. It's easier to show that. When every program is doing something different, it's difficult to show how the organizational is progressing towards those strategic goals. So thinking about evaluation before you're writing the grant, when you're having those conversations with your grant team, is really important because you want to understand how those programs are being evaluated. There have been times where it's a new program, right? It hasn't been evaluated yet. That's okay. You just want to be able to articulate how you plan to evaluate. Another piece of the common grant element is your organizational capacity. That's, again, goes back to your organizational readiness. So you want to be able to talk about other types of grants that you've implemented. You want to talk about how long the programs, have been in place and your experience, expertise of the staff. Why this is the opportunity in the organizational capacity to show why you're unique. You might be doing something similar as many other organizations, but what's the thing that makes you stand out? That's something you really want to make sure it shines in your organizational capacity section. Then, of course, you have your budget justification. Those are really important pieces. We're going to talk a little bit more about the budget, but one of my colleagues, we both worked as a grant reviewer at the federal level, and she said, I always start with the budget. That's what I read first. If the budget doesn't make sense to me, then how is the rest of the application going to make sense? And it's a really good point. That budget has to be really clear. You have to understand what they're asking for it to make sense in the actual application. So your budget is telling a story. It's showing what the need is. So you really want to make sure it matches your need statement and it matches what your program description is. And then you have attachments, and those can really range. I've seen some applications where there's no attachment. I am currently working on an application that's a foundation application that has 12 attachments. And some of those are like drafting like a timeline or a logic model. And then some of them are just like your standard, maybe your IRS, letter or your audit and things like that. But there's typically some sort of attachments that are required. So pay extra attention to that, because if you miss an attachment, it could disqualify you. They may not even look at the application, and you certainly don't want that to be the case after you work so hard on it. So going back to what we talked about for the needs section, this is really where you want to rely on your team, your grant team, to tell you what's going on, to be able to articulate why the program is needed, and data. Sometimes, if you don't have a lot of institutional data, like I said, find information in the area. What is the population? What is the poverty rate? What is it that can make your need, why you're doing this, really stand out? When we talk about, especially at the national level, if you're looking at big national funders or you're looking at large government funders, you want to be able to make sure that they understand the need in this area. So you want to present a lot of geographic information, demographic information. You want to be able to paint the picture of what your community looks like and what its needs are. Ways to, if you're not currently collecting data, here are some ways you can do it. Interviews and observations, right? Talking to the people who you're serving. Just collecting that information, sitting down, 2-minute conversation, asking a few questions, or a focus group is another great way to gather information. A lot of organizations like to use a survey, a client survey. It can be like a satisfaction survey, and they don't have to be extremely long or complicated or scientific. It could be very basic, just 5 or 6 questions, just to kind of gather a sense of how they feel about the programs and how they're progressing along. And that's a type of information that you can use in your grant proposal and your reports to show how you're working towards success. So this is a very high-level view of a logic model. I'm a bit of a logic model dork. I love logic models. And the reason that I love them is because I like to do a logic model before working on any big applications, especially a government application. It really helps with the program design piece if you have your logic model done first and then everyone's agreed on it, right? Program staff has seen it, and that's good. It helps the finance people come up with the budget. So having a logic model is really what's going to help you with your program design. But even more so, we see a logic model as a required attachment, especially for government grants. I've seen it. We've had to do logic models for both state and federal grants as a required attachment. And the reason is just because it helps, like I say, it helps me when I'm designing that program. It helps the funder get a really nice snapshot of what your program is and what it's doing. So using this as part of your program design is going to set you up for success, for sure. And when we think about a logic model, the things that you want to include in there. So the first column is usually the inputs. And your inputs are the things that the resources you have, right? Your staff, maybe it's curriculum you've already developed. Maybe it's the building that you're in or the classroom space you're going to use. These are all the resources that you have, training that you've undergone, that you're going to utilize for this program, right? It's the things that you can leverage to help you do this program. Then you have your activities. The activities are the things you're going to do. So in your activities, let's just say, you're going to offer mental health therapy to, children between the ages of 14 and 18. And then you're going to also offer group therapy. And then you're also going to, you could break it down, all the specific activities that you're going to do. So, and get granular with it too, in terms of your activities. Really think about the detail behind them, and that will help you think about what your impact is, and to make sure that what you're doing gets you to where you want to be, right? So what's the impact? What's the problem you're trying to solve? Make sure your activities align with that. So then what your outputs are the actual, they're the result of your activities. They're like the measurement, right? We use a lot of times when we're doing a logic model for training, and we might do an interactive, we do an interactive logic model training, and we use the cookie baking. We use cookie baking. So say your program's to bake cookies, right? Your activity is going to be each step of baking the cookies. You're cracking the eggs, right? You're putting the, I like chocolate chips, so I'm putting my chocolate chips in. You're adding the flour, you're mixing, right? You're pouring the cookies onto the pan. All of these are all the things you're going to do with your program. Then what's your output? Your outputs are the number of cookies. Your outputs are the number of people who were involved in the baking. Maybe your output's the number of dirty pots and pans. And if you're anything like me, there'll be a lot. For some reason, I always make a mess when I'm baking. That's what we're talking about with outputs. They are your actual number. Now, your outcome, that is your results, the change that happens, okay? Outputs, hard number, outcomes, the actual change. Excuse me. And sometimes you'll see this broken out between short-term outcomes, long-term outcomes, maybe sometimes intermediate outcomes, especially if you have a long grant period. If you're looking at a grant that's like 1, 2, we just worked on a grant not too long ago, it was a 5-year grant. In that case, you're going to show outcomes, periodically. But they're the change. So if we're thinking back to our chocolate cookies, maybe, an immediate outcome is your full belly or the smile on your face from getting, eating cookies. And these are the types of things we're thinking about. What's the change we want to see? The outcomes kind of tie into like your big goal statement, the big impact that you're trying to make. So doing this exercise, doing a logic model when you're doing your program design and writing your program description helps you really understand what the program is. And then you can turn that and write it into a narrative form. And there's a specific kind of framework we recommend when thinking about writing your goals and objectives. Now, I know we talked about outputs, outcomes, objectives. Objectives are another aspect of proposal design, and really they tie into the multiple pieces of your logic model. So think of your objective as kind of the narrative you describe. It's the things you're going to do to get to your goal. So if you're thinking about, if your goal is to climb the top of the ladder, each objective is going to be the rung, right? It's each rung. What do you have to do to get up to that top of the ladder? So when you have an objective statement, it kind of ties in all pieces of the inputs, activities, outputs, and outcomes. It kind of ties it all together. And the acronym we use to help you write really strong objectives is called SMART. And SMART stands for specific, measurable, attainable, relevant, and time bound. And if you go through each one of those letters with your objective statement, then you're going to come through really strong objectives. And the reason this is important is because it helps you with your program design on the front end, but also we have seen many funders specifically say, not to overuse the word specific, but say they want SMART objectives and call that out in applications. I've seen that in federal level applications. I've seen it in foundation applications too. We just worked on one that was in New York State. That was a big health foundation. And they fund hundreds of millions of dollars every year in mental health. And all the funders, everyone applying to them, one of the questions was, what are your SMART objectives? And the reason they asked that is because it's kind of like asking for a logic model. It gives a really strong snapshot of what your program is. So when we say that your objective should be specific, what we mean by that is it ties back to your need, to the problem that you're trying to address, and that it ties into a particular activity. So we went back in the logic model, we're talking about, all right, here are the activities you're going to do. It makes it really easy to understand what actions you're taking with this grant funding, with this program. You also have measurable, which measurable is often an overlooked SMART element. And what that means is that's where your output is. So when we talk about the number being served, in my example, we talk about the number of cookies being baked. You know, they want to understand what's the measurement here. How do you know you're being successful? How many are you going to serve? What are you going to do? And what is that measurement piece? And maybe it's not necessarily like, oh, we served 10 people. It could be that. Maybe it's something like, 80% of the participants gained knowledge in this space, something. It could be like a percentage. It could be we're talking about an increase in something or a decrease in something, but you want them to understand that you know what your baseline is and you're able to measure and evaluate your programs. And that's where that measurement piece ties into. So in terms of attainable, what that relates to is thinking about you as an organization, can you achieve this? If you're talking about using funding to hire, let's say, one caseworker, and you say your output, your measurement is to serve 1,000 people with that one caseworker over 12 months. The funder's going to know right off the bat that is not attainable. That's not attainable for any organization. That poor caseworker would probably quit after day 2. So that's what it means by attainable. Is it feasible? Can the organization that you've explained you are do the things you said you're going to do? You want it to be relevant to your mission, but also feasible. You don't want to set yourself up for failure. Don't think you have to put in these big numbers to impress them or stand out. You don't want to put in big numbers, big outputs, and then when it's time to report, you have to say, we didn't achieve this. It's not going to help your relationship with the funder, and it will more than likely, not get you awarded again. So you want it to be something that you actually can do. And I often say, estimate a little low, because it's always better to say you overachieved than it is to say you underachieved. And when we say relevant, that ties back into the problem that you said you're addressing. You don't want it to be something that's completely off topic from whatever your need statement is. They're going to wonder, it's going to draw a lot of questions up. And anytime funders have lots of questions, it's not necessarily a good thing. And the other piece of it is time bound. So sometimes you see that written as timely. And what that means is that every objective should have a time frame. So you might say something like, in year 1, A, B, and C will happen. Or in quarter 1, or in the first month, whatever it is, there's no right or wrong, but you just want them to know when this specific objective is going to be achieved, right? So if we were back to baking cookies, we can say, in my oven's usually about 12 minutes. In 12 minutes, we'll have 8 cookies, or something like that, because it's helping them understand that you can achieve the things you say you're going to do in the time you say you're going to do it. I wouldn't recommend having all of your objectives, saying by the end of the time. So say you have a 12-month grant period and you say, oh, by month 12, this will happen. And all your objectives are like by the end of the year, whatever it is. I don't think that's a strong, objective, because you want to be able to show incremental, improvement. And you want to be able to show that you're making progress throughout the grant period. So maybe it's an objective can be something about in the first 30 days, we'll hire this position, or we'll onboard someone, or we'll order the equipment. You don't have to think like it's just about what the end result is. You want to be able to show them progress throughout the grant period. So that's what it means by time bound. And I tend to start my objectives with the time frame. So I'll often start with saying like, oh, in year 2, etc., or in year 1, this will happen, something like that. And then going back to evaluation. So the reason that goals and objectives are really important is because these are the things that you're going to have to report on, and you're going to have to be able to measure. So when we're thinking about your results, what is the thing this grant's going to help you do, and how are you going to measure it? Understanding that before you're even writing the grant, I think, is really, really important. So here's an actual example that's listed from an application that we recently worked on. It is asking how the organization measures impact in the outcomes listed. So your outcomes are like the change you want to see, right? You might have short-term, you might have long-term, but they're the change you want to see. And how you're measuring impact for each one of those outcomes. And a lot of times what we'll do is we might see this presented in like a table. That's a great way to do it because they're asking who's responsible for it. You know, what is the tool that you're using to measure? Are you doing client surveys? Are you doing focus groups? Are you doing interviews? How are you collecting the data? And when are you doing that? Are you doing that quarterly? Are you doing it, you know, annually? How often do you collect that client feedback? And why is it measured that way? So if it's about client satisfaction, if it's about maybe it's programming that's related to some sort of curriculum or academic involvement, could you use grades to show improvement? You know, there's different ways to do it, but you have to be able to say why you're doing it this way. What is the purpose of using that type of evaluation? And that brings us into our budget, which, like I said in the beginning, the budget must align with the narrative. The budget is often a place where the most questions get asked. In fact, we had 2 organizations we worked with this week had a funder come back and ask questions about the budget. They wanted to understand why there was so much in salaries. They want to understand the breakdown better. You know, so I always suggest giving a really detailed budget. If you have, for example, if the funding is going to support more than 1 staff person, don't just have 1 staff line that just says like staff and total amount. Put, you know, Maggie and Susie and, you know, whoever, and they're going to be funded at this percent and it's going to be this total, so that they can really see who's involved and where the funding's going. If you have supplies, if you have, you know, other than personnel expenses, add the detail to it so that the funder can see. Sometimes they'll follow up with questions and they'll give you kind of an opportunity to provide a more detailed budget, but there are a lot of funders that will just look at it, not understand it, and then not move you forward. So you want the budget to really tie into the objectives that you call out and your program design. You want it all to match and tell the same story. And so here are some examples of some of the common inconsistencies that you might see in a narrative versus the budget itself. One of them is that there'll be people listed in the narrative that aren't listed in the budget. And sometimes that's even someone who's part of the program, maybe the grant's not supporting. That's okay, but still list them in the budget, and you can list it as in kind, or you can put a 0 next to them as like part of the grant. But don't, because that's going to raise a question. So if I'm listed in the grant as supporting the program, if I'm listed in the narrative, we're talking about my expertise, and then they look at the budget like, wait, I don't see Maggie. They spent a lot of time talking about, you know, her qualifications, and she's not listed. It's going to raise questions. So like I said, provide that detail. Well, Maggie's in the budget. She's giving 10% of her time as in kind, or 10% of the time is going to go, you know, against the grant. So having that, making sure you're consistent in who you're talking about in the narrative, especially in that organizational section, and then who's included in the budget is really important. And the salaries that are going to be included in, like I showed you that example, they wanted to know who's responsible for each of these outcomes. That's here, and the percent of time on each. Budget, equipment, supplies, that's often a big question because we see them often grouped together, like there's just a supplies line, but it's not clear what kind of supplies they're the funding is supporting. And supplies can mean lots of things. So sometimes it makes funders nervous because is it going to really support this program? Is the possibility that these supplies could be supporting something else that isn't really included in the budget? So that's another example of where you want to provide the detail. A lot of funders have a template you have to use. They'll have a budget template to use. Always use their template. If they provide one, always use it. But if they don't, just come up with a structure within your organization of being able to provide a very detailed budget, project budget. Like I said, a lot of times you have to do an organizational budget and a project budget. But for that project budget, when it ties to the grant, you want to provide as much detail as possible. This is one of the things that makes our team unique. We have multiple sets of eyes that looks at every proposal. So if I'm working on a proposal, I'm the writer, I'm the lead writer on it, we have someone else who edits the proposal. And the reason is because, you know, when you're writing it and you're so close to it, it's kind of hard to see the flaws, right? Or even the small grammatical errors. It's hard to keep track of all that when you're so close to something. If you absolutely do not have someone who can help you edit, or you're really wearing all the hats in the organization, that's okay. Take a break from it. Don't look at it for a day and then look at it fresh, right? Read the proposal fresh, like a day or two later, like take a weekend or something. Then you'll catch things. But we highly recommend just asking a colleague, asking someone, hey, can you read this over? You know, see if you see any outstanding grammar things. But also, just does it make sense? Like, do you have questions? Because it doesn't take, you know, you don't, unless you're going for a very scientific proposal, it's like NIH or something, someone can read and just say, does it have good readability? Is it, you know, presenting the information well? And that's really helpful. And when we do government proposals, we actually have a panel of mock reviewers. So we have 3 mock reviewers who score the application, just like the rubric and the guidelines call out. So if it's like 20% for the needs section and, you know, 10% for the budget or whatever it is, we have a team who has not seen the proposal yet. They look at it and they score it, and it's all a fresh perspective. So then we can come back and say, all right, what areas do we need to strengthen? There's always something. Nothing's ever 100%. There's always places you can strengthen or be clearer, add more detail to. And that's why we really recommend having what we call a second set of eyes take a look at those proposals. Okay, I said a lot of things. I know we only have a couple minutes left here. I'm happy if there's any questions or, you know, concerns, anything I can clarify, please feel free to add to the chat now. If not, feel free to email me. As you can tell, I love talking about grants and all things grants. So if a question pops in your head after the fact and you want to reach out, please feel free to. But otherwise, it's been a pleasure spending my afternoon with you.
Yay, thank you so much, Maggie. That was a lot of really helpful information. Oh, let me show that slide for a second. More contact info to reach out to the D.H. Leonard Consulting team. Then we have our webinar feedback survey. I do have that link for you in the shared notes. We hope you can join us for our next webinar. That will be, I forgot to switch the date, but that's actually going to be on May 20th. So that'll be next week. Sorry, guys, I missed that date change, but that'll be on wills versus trusts from Shantae Moore, who is a certified financial educator. Feel free to access this as well as our other recorded webinars. Our webinar archive has moved to our YouTube channel. There's a whole playlist called the Catheta Webinars Archive. That link that you see on the screen is also in the shared notes section. We hope you can check out our upcoming training events. We post about them to our various social media. We are on Facebook, Instagram, LinkedIn, and Twitter. And if you are a podcast listener, you can check out our in-house produced podcasts, the Hopathanga Native American podcast, wherever you listen to your podcasts. And if you're like me and you actually prefer to watch people interview their guests, we record those videos and we put that on our YouTube channel as well. There's another playlist called the Hopathanga Native American podcast, and you can check out the episodes there. We actually just interviewed the Secretary of HUD, Secretary Scott Turner. So that was really exciting. That's our most recent episode, episode 170. But other than that, that is all we have for you today, folks. Thank you so much for tuning in for today's webinar. We recognize you could spend your time anywhere, and we appreciate that you spend it with us working on your professional development. But we can't wait to catch you next time, and we hope you have a fantastic rest of your week and weekend.
Thank you.
Thanks so much, Megan.
Currently the only person in this conference.